former U.S. Senator Slade Gorton and former Attorney General Rob McKenna. Thank you both again for being here. I had the honor of having both of you at another event some years ago under our State Reform banner. I appreciate that the scars from that experience have healed and that you've returned. I thank you. Senator Gorton, let me just ask you to put this time in Republican Party politics in some context, and specifically this time with President Trump and his impact, his role, his all of the meaning and lessons from his time in office. What does this mean for the future of the Republican Party in the United States?
Well, President Trump has caused a much larger than normal turnover among candidates in the Republican Party, at least at the national level, and I suspect at the level of many states as well. Far more of our members have decided not to run again in 2018 as a result. And Trump supporters, all the way from normal conservatives to the alt-right, are in the ascendant. We just have to look at an election that's going on right now in Alabama to see that the establishment candidate was significantly beaten in the primary. This is going to take place in a wide range of other states as well, particularly southern states and the Mountain West. Their influence is not as great here on the Pacific Coast states, and it's smaller still probably in New England and the northeastern part of the country. But we may be seeing another shakeout in the party. My observation is that the two parties are mirror images of one another in one respect. New people coming into the Republican Party and the Republican politics almost always come in from the right. They come in from the most conservative part of the party. Then when they win, they find that to win real elections, they have to moderate. They tend to do so, and then they're overtaken by another wave from the right. The Democratic Party is the exact opposite. The new people come in from the left. The Sanders, the Bernie-crats, who have the Democratic Party in some considerable degree of disability at the present time. Mm-hmm. And so, in my view, the result of that was, last year in the presidential election, both parties failed the American people because they left the center entirely unoccupied.
So, you're back in D.C., Senator, about once a month, I understand. How would you characterize the sentiment among members of Congress in the Senate, also in the House, the sentiment in their private comments to you about what it's like to serve in Congress as Republicans in this time?
I find it very interesting because I go back to Washington, D.C. every month and see at least 2 or 3 of my former colleagues and their successors. And in many cases, they just pretend that it didn't exist. They work on their own bills, they're on their own states, and try to act as though everything were normal.
Yeah.
I find that rather interesting, except for those who are about to quit, like Corker and Flake, who come out very articulately against the president. But most of them just wish that it would be business as usual and are trying to act as though it is business as usual.
Yeah. I understand, Senator, that you turned 90 years old on January 8th. Congratulations.
Not there yet.
Yeah, we should all be so lucky. Rob, let me ask you, it seems like we've got a little bit of a reaction in the city of Seattle, in particular, but also in some parts of the Democratic Party that is just moving farther. It's becoming more activated, more animated on the left in response to this time. Is that opening up middle, as Senator Gorton spoke to? Is that opening up a new middle in Washington State, or is in electoral politics, or is the reality more than ever that party orthodoxy on left and right is is a bar you've got to get over. That if you're not an orthodox left or right a candidate, that you have no chance.
Yeah. Well, living and working in Seattle now, I see a lot of folks who are, traditional Democrats feeling pushed out or pushed aside a bit by the rise of, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party, or even farther to the left of them. But I think that was a trend that was occurring before the 2016 elections took place. Mm-hmm. That election has probably accelerated the trend. It's given folks farther to the left even more grist for the mill, and importantly, it conceals fissures in the Democratic coalition because you're always more cohesive when you're in the minority. It works the same way when the Republicans are in the minority. When you're in power, the gaps and differences become more pronounced, as we've seen happen in Congress over the last several months. But when you're out of power, it's easier to unite around what you're opposed to, and you spend a lot of energy talking about what you oppose, and less time talking about what you want to do. Those conversations are not as public. So I think that what we're seeing in Seattle has been part of a long-term trend. It has probably been accelerated or enhanced by the 2016 elections, but it was happening already.
This is a question that requires either a graduate level course or a gross oversimplification. I'll ask you to grossly oversimplify to some degree, but Republicans hold, as we know, more seats at this federal, state, and local level than at any time in history, I believe, since the Republican Party really got its feet underneath it in 1860. Why have they proven at the federal level to be have so much trouble governing, at least in the policy-making arena? What are your thoughts? I'm not asking about the day-to-day, blow-to-blow kind of pugilism of legislation, but culturally, why are Republicans having such a hard time at the federal level?
Well, I'll defer to Senator Gorton on the issue of why Congress isn't getting more done, because he has more of the expertise there. I would just observe that we're a country of two major political parties, which means we're a country of two parties that are coalitions. We all understand that. There probably will not be a third party or a fourth party. If there were, we would have seen it before now on a sustained basis. Every once in a while, a third party springs up and it's around for one cycle and then it disappears. I think what's happening in Congress is emblematic of the difficulties of governing when you're leading a coalition, which, as Senator Gorton's pointed out, is pretty diverse right now.
Yeah.
I'll put most of my answer, though, into the issue of, or to respond to what's happening at the state level. Mm-hmm. As you pointed out, we're at if not an all-time record, a recent record for Republican influence in the states. There are 99 legislative chambers in America because Nebraska only has a unicameral legislature. And Republicans, after the 2016 elections, controlled 66 of them, and controlled 32 or 33 governorships and a record number of attorney general positions, and right down the ballot. And at the state level, a lot is being done, a lot is happening. Mm-hmm. Republicans who control state governments are pushing ahead an agenda that's pretty broad and deep, and they're showing that it is possible to get things done. Congress is almost a special case in that regard. So again, I defer to Slade to talk about that in more detail.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about Congress not having done anything, but I think you need to be a little bit more precise. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed many bills of significant weight and in a conservative direction. They've all died in the Senate, and they've died in the Senate because of the filibuster rule. Basically, it takes 60 votes, not 51, in the Senate to pass major legislation, except under an arcane system called reconciliation, which is the way tax reform is being discussed at the present time. And I do make my views known when I talk to senators back east, but I have no impact on them at all. 3 or 4 years ago, the Democrats effectively abolished the filibuster rule with respect to all appointments except appointments of nominations for the Supreme Court of the United States. The way in which they did it, in my opinion, killed the value of the filibuster. because the filibuster rule can be changed with 51 votes at will. That was done by Republicans earlier this year in order to get the Supreme Court nominee through. And I have strongly suggested to the Republican leadership in the Senate that they abolish the rest of the filibuster rule. It's a corpse lying on the floor of the Senate, tripping up only people who want to be tripped up. And under those circumstances, there would be a great deal of legislation passing Congress, even in a Trump administration.
Yeah, interesting. Rob, how would you characterize the opportunities Republicans have in Washington state politically? Do you think that this time of President Trump is going to create a backlash, a blue wave that Republicans will have to endure? Or do you think that, this really comes down to the candidates that are recruited and the special, unique nature of each campaign, and that there are some significant opportunities to take back perhaps majorities in the legislature in 2018? How do you think this plays out electorally in the state?
Well, I guess that's the question we're going to see play out over the next several months leading up to the election. And I can't predict with any certainty what the effects at the national level will be on the state level. In 2006, we saw a very difficult midterm election for Republicans in the state, resulting in significant losses in the House and the state Senate. And if you all recall, that was driven in large part by opposition to the Iraq War and the Bush administration. There were very intense feelings that our candidates were encountering at the doorstep when they were doorbelling in their legislative districts. And that resulted in significant Democratic majorities for a while. But every election after 2006, including special elections, the House Republicans gained ground, and ultimately the Senate Republicans with a coalition were able to control the Senate. So it's possible that 2018 could be like the 2006 midterms, or it could be that it won't be as pronounced. It's difficult to estimate because the demographics of the state have changed a lot.
Yeah.
So areas that were blue have gotten even deeper blue, like Seattle. The suburbs around Seattle have turned blue since 2006, but other parts of the state have gone more in the Republican direction, like Southwest Washington. So I think it will be a challenging year for Republicans in 2018. But as you suggested, if you have good candidates, if those candidates know what to talk about at the local level, talking to their constituents, that makes a difference also. And you sometimes see less of an effect on legislative races than you would see on congressional races, for example, when what's driving the election is federal in nature.
Yeah.
Rob is right on in his description of, I think, what impact it will have here in the state. I think from a national point of view, the Trump presidency is an unmitigated disaster for Republicans. The president has a constituency, a hard support constituency, of maybe as many as 30% of the people in the United States. That's not a formula for winning elections.
Yeah, 30% doesn't normally carry the day, does it? Rob, let me ask you a specific question to Seattle. Representative Noel Frame, who represents the 36th legislative district, Democrat, has said that income taxes have become weaponized. Seattle City Council passed income tax proposal. It's the purpose, I think, the intent for which was to have it go to the courts and see if a new definition of income related to property could be determined by this court. You're one of the lead litigants saying, trying to appeal that action. Bring us up to speed, maybe just in some broad brushstrokes, on where that legal case is and whether you think there will be any electoral consequences maybe outside the city of Seattle as suburbanites, rural folks look to the deep blue city, so to speak.
Well, let me answer your question first, and then I'll provide more background on the case.
Yeah.
The answer to your question is that I don't think that the case will have a great effect outside of the city of Seattle politically, except perhaps in a few places, maybe Port Townsend, which has talked about adopting an income tax. I think this ordinance is really about creating a test case for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So let me explain what that means and what the strategy is. If you're a proponent of a state income tax you face a number of challenges, a number of hurdles to get there. One of the hurdles is statutory, because we have a statute on the books dating back to 1984, which says that cities and city counties shall not impose a tax on net income, which Judge Rule in the King County Superior Court correctly interpreted to mean shall not impose an income tax. The legislative history of that bill is quite clear. Former Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge, who is on my legal team along with former Chief Justice Gary Alexander, laid that history out in the Superior Court very persuasively. It's a ban on income taxes, but it's in statute. So that's not as much of a barrier or hurdle if you want a state income tax, because statutes can be changed with majority votes in the legislature and then the governor's signature. The higher barrier or obstacle to advocates for a state income tax is our state constitution and our state Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. In 1930, the voters of the state, with over 70% approval, passed Amendment number 14 to the state constitution, which redefined the word property under the state constitution. It defined property just about as broadly as you could using English, because what it says is that property is everything, tangible or intangible, subject to ownership. 3 years later, the state Supreme Court ruled in overturning a voter-approved state income tax that income is property, that it falls within the definition of property under our Constitution because it's an intangible and it can become tangible if it's converted to an asset, and because it is subject to ownership. This has put the city of Seattle in the position of arguing in the Superior Court and in their briefing that you don't actually own your income. The judge was not persuaded. And this highlights the challenge that the city faces and that proponents of an income tax face. Under this Supreme Court interpretation or application of the definition of property, we cannot have a progressive income tax in the state of Washington. And if we have a flat income tax, it can't be higher than 1%, because the constitutional limitation on property taxes is 1% a year. So this is what the city of Seattle hopes they will reverse by creating a case going to, they hope, the state Supreme Court ultimately, where the Supreme Court will be asked to undo 85 years of its own rulings, not just the 1933 decision, but several decisions after 1933 in which the state Supreme Court reinforced its original ruling, simply citing to the plain language of Amendment 14 to the Constitution. There are two ways that can be undone. One way is to amend the Constitution. That would be the correct way to do it, in my view, and in the view of the people that I represent, the individual plaintiffs in my case, because you can change it if you can get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate and a majority of the voters to approve it. Of course, 9 times this has been on the ballot, this idea of a state income tax, and it's lost every single time. The voters haven't wanted it. Nor is it likely that 2/3 of the House and the Senate will vote to amend the Constitution to permit a progressive income tax. And so the city and the interest groups that have been working with it and its advocates have created this case to ask the Supreme Court to simply reinterpret that plain language, to ignore stare decisis, which is the principle of continuity in appellate decision making, and to come up with a new interpretation which somehow excludes income from the concept of property, intangible or tangible, which is subject to ownership. So where we're headed now is the appellate level. We won in King County Superior Court. It was a very clear, very strong opinion by the judge. The city now, as the appellant, has signaled its intention to a petition and has petitioned for direct review. It's filed for a notice of appeal, will petition for direct review, and the Supreme Court can decide whether to retain the case or transfer it to the Court of Appeals. There's no way to know for sure how long it'll take to make that decision, but one way or the other, it'll be heard by the Supreme Court itself immediately, or by the Court of Appeals first.
And there's at least as good a substantive argument against an income tax as we learned about 4 or 5 years ago when we had our last election on it. The 8 or 9 states out of 50 that do not have state income taxes over a period of about 40 years grew almost twice as rapidly as the 41 states that did have an income tax. So the passage of an income tax in this state is an invitation to slow down our economic growth dramatically and significantly.
Let me ask you both, do you think the system of taxation in Washington state deserves some reform? I mean, you know, we have by any count, a very regressive tax system compared to other states. The nature of our economy has shifted from resource to manufacturing to service, and now we're in this sort of increasingly technology-oriented space. Our tax regime hasn't changed 2 or 3 or 4 times. And a lot of folks, I think, are probably justified, whether one is progressive or conservative. A lot of folks would argue that working class folks are taxed too much. And I think there's broad agreement, you know, on both left and right in some circles. So what are your thoughts on on whether this is a problem to be solved? And if it is a problem, what are some of the principles we might look towards to try to nudge a tax reform proposal forward?
Well, the first thing you do when you find yourself in a hole is you stop digging. And that means stop increasing taxes that you believe are regressive. You know, and yet we continually, you know, see government agencies asking for tax increases, even in a growing economy with large increases in tax revenue year over year. The city of Seattle's budget has increased, I've seen figures ranging from 27 to 38%, depending on what you're measuring, just over 4 years. It's a massive increase. The state budget has grown a great deal. Notwithstanding that growth in revenue, in the ordinance Seattle adopted to create a city income tax, there is no reduction in any other tax. And they adopted the ordinance shortly after adopting other tax increases, which they would have to admit are regressive, like a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. Mm-hmm. So, you know, stop digging the hole. Secondly, be politically realistic. As Governor Gregoire observed in a recent interview, I guess it was a couple months ago now, the people of the state have been pretty clear that they're not interested in an income tax. Yeah. Every county, including King County, voted against Initiative 1098 back in 2010. You know, the voters of the state are kind of like the voters in Oregon in that respect. When they're asked to approve a sales tax to add it to their income tax, they repeatedly and resoundingly rejected. So I think you have to be politically realistic in that regard. So I think there is room for reform, but I don't think the voters in the state are ever going to want, at least not in the next several decades, an income tax.
Right. The sales tax has one very significant advantage, and that is that everyone pays it. So that legislators, local or state, who vote for it, know that they're penalizing, they're collecting money from everyone. The income tax, as you've seen with all the arguments here, oh, that's only the 1%, it's only millionaires. You can vote for a tax that you won't pay, but that someone else will. It tends to create a degree of class warfare, and it also tends to be very unsophisticated, because that's the way you start, but pretty soon it applies to everyone.
So what's going to happen in the legislature with the Democrats having a majority of 1 in the Senate and a majority of 2 in the House is they're going to consider a capital gains income tax. Mm-hmm. Because this is the income tax nose under the tent. Mm-hmm. And it'll be subjected to a legal challenge, just as the income. The interesting thing about the income tax is I studied the history going back to the early 1930s, is there are really no new ideas. Yeah. Everything that's being discussed now, everything that's being proposed, has been proposed before, usually starting in the 1930s. And so indeed, in that era, there was a proposal for a kind of a capital gains tax. Yeah. There have been other proposals to set up excise taxes on income, and they've all either been defeated at the ballot box by wide margins or overturned by the courts. So look, they can choose to do what they want in the legislature and spend the time on the issues they want, but it's challenging, particularly with such slim majorities. So my own prediction is that they're going to not pass a capital gains income tax, not pass a carbon tax, because they won't want to jeopardize their majorities. Instead, they'll hang back and wait till this fall's elections in hopes of expanding their majorities, and then in January of 2019, in the long session, take a run at those measures. And we'll see how much success they have, but that's the game plan that I would predict we'll see play out.
Yeah. Senator, I know we spoke over dinner last night about the 1986 tax reform bill and your advocacy to ensure that state and local taxes were allowed as deductions for federal income tax purposes. That was ultimately stricken. It was included in the Senate bill because of your leadership, and it was stricken from conference, as I heard you tell me last night. It was not included in the current Senate bill, as I understand it. Do you think that is, some people frame that as a sort of punishment of blue states, which have often higher state and local taxes. Is it that well thought out in the Senate, or is the fact that those will not be allowed deductions moving forward under the Senate bill, is that just an old pay-for that has been brought back out?
Well, from our perspective, by far the worst element of a very good, otherwise very good tax reform in 1986 was that it allowed the deduction of state income taxes, but not of state sales taxes. It was Bob Packwood's revenge on Washington for being a better state than Oregon.
Yeah.
And there was no principle behind that distinction, whatsoever. Either you should treat all taxes, state and local taxes, equally, all in or all out. Personally, I think removing that deduction for state taxes is a good conservative idea in the present tax reform, because we are just subsidizing the very high tax states like New York and California. If those taxes are not deductible, those legislatures will find it much more difficult to increase taxes and will in fact be under pressure to lower some of them. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the items that's being debated as we sit here today. And it'll be decided probably sometime in the next week.
Yeah.
But ending those deductions helps deal with the federal deficit, and it also has an anti-tax prejudice as states go forward.
You are well regarded in the Republican Party, but also in society in general, I think. Senators having empowered women on your staff from a very early age. Governor Gregoire was a former staff member of yours, of course, as you know, and she always spoke warmly of the opportunities that you provided her. You mentioned Bob Packwood, who, of course, resigned amid some sexual harassment allegations, and there was a vote to remove him, or a pending vote to remove him from the Senate. How do you put the time we are in now, this Me Too moment, how do you put this Me Too moment within the context of your broader political career? Is it truly different? Has it always been this way? Has it just been swept under the covers? What are your thoughts on this moment?
Well, Bob Packwood was, it turned out, a serial abuser, but I served probably 8 or 10 years in the United States Senate with him, and never had the slightest hint from anyone, even a vague rumor, that he was engaged in such activities. And that's a bad thing. And today, at least we're getting these things out in front of people so that they can make up their minds about various individuals. Unfortunately, right now, just as we sit here, it's almost the only subject we're talking about, and ignoring the threat of North Korea, the infrastructure needs, healthcare, tax reform, and the like.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing, and people should be held accountable, but it will also be a good thing to start talking about the real issues facing the country as well.
Yeah. Rob, how about your perspective on this topic? How do you put this Me Too moment in context politically?
Actually, I feel that this is the beginning of a permanent shift that should lead to improvements, higher levels of accountability, more consequences for abusers and harassers. It doesn't mean the problem will go away, of course, but I think and the attention level will eventually decline somewhat, but it will remain at a higher level than it was before we started. It's what Anthony Downs called the issue attention cycle, which he actually mapped for various issues of public importance. So I think this is a signal moment for women in our country, and it needs to be. And I think the longer it goes on, the better in terms of outing individuals who are serial abusers and have been harassing women. I think, secondly, that the steps that people like Slade Gorton took when he was in office to empower women and bring them into positions that they could then leverage into positions of leadership was extremely important, because we're likelier to see a permanent shift in our country in attitudes and in results with more women in power. So that was really important.
I also want to just sort of maybe throw open questions from the audience. I can't see very well because of the lights, but maybe Rita or our team can help flag me down if any of you have a question. Rita, do I see already you have one? No. Okay, great. So I see you, and then, okay. What do you think about, maybe I'm interested in what you both think of the current state of the Republican Party insofar as this coalition that you both mentioned, that both parties are a coalition. They sort of tend to break up or sort of spread apart. They tend to come back together tightly and uniformly over time. Are we in a period of cohesion in the Republican Party? And does the old Republican coalition still exist of national security Republicans, economic security, and social issue conservatives? Is that still the Republican Party, Senator, or do you see it differently?
Well, we live in a country that has traditionally had two political parties. But we live in a country in which there are far more than two attitudes toward politics in the direction that government ought to take. And so that means that each party is obviously going to be a coalition. It's going to have people who hope that they have more in common than they have differences with other people in the party. But from the very beginning, each of our parties has been a coalition, and it will continue to be a coalition unless it's just going to turn into a European type of situation where everyone with given views gets together and you have 8 or 10 different parties and always have coalition governments, which then, of course, operate at the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And so it may be that those coalitions change somewhat, and that certainly holds true here in the state, where, as Rob said earlier, at least the near-in suburban counties have gone from being very Republican to at least significantly Democratic, where the Democratic Party stopped really thinking about working people other than those in public service unions probably 30 or 40 years ago, and is catching up to them elsewhere. So what we have now is we have a Seattle and a Seattle area that's solidly and overwhelmingly Democratic, and a rural part of the state, both in the east and along the coast, that is already very heavily Republican or becoming so. But it just simply means that parts of the coalition have shifted with one another. It doesn't mean that both parties aren't still coalitions. They just are hardly recognizable, or would hardly be recognizable to people 50 years ago.
Yeah, I remember in 1994, you won, if I recall correctly, majority of union households, so there was a shift there. In 2012, I recall, Rob, you had, from an outsider's perspective, a really challenging time trying to navigate this sort of insurgent Tea Party right side of the, maybe righter than what most people thought of themselves as the right. I think a lot of people thought they were the right, and then there was the Tea Party. Managing that and keeping it in your coalition to be able to then also speak to the center, where a lot of your voters in King County and who had voted for you for Attorney General had been with you in the past. Do you still see that kind of separation within the right of this sort of vibrant, almost not quite alt-right, but very like almost anti-system, anti-institutional right?
The numbers of those folks are pretty small. It probably cost me 40,000 votes in 2012, which is not a large number when you're talking about more than 3 million votes cast.
Yeah.
I won 47 of 49 legislative districts. If you add up those 47, I had a lead. Governor Inslee's margin came entirely from 2 legislative districts in Seattle, where he got 85% of the vote in the 36th and the 43rd, along with Barack Obama and other Democrats. So that's what made the 3.5 point.
I've never heard that before. That's, wow.
So that's what made the 3.5 point difference, and that's that's the way politics is supposed to work. Their voters got out the vote, and they were highly motivated, not so much by those of us on the ballot, but by 2 ballot measures, marriage and pot. Which clearly drove turnout very heavily in Seattle and to some extent elsewhere. Ironically, neither of those measures was on the ballot because of the Democrats. Marriage was on the ballot because people on the far right decided to challenge the marriage equality law that had passed the legislature, put it up for a vote through referendum. Mm-hmm. And pot was on the ballot because of the forces that wanted to legalize pot. Neither Inslee or I supported that measure. It wasn't on the ballot because of the Democrats, certainly not because of the Republicans. So that's just politics, right? You have all these factors that come into play, and those definitely had an impact on driving heavier turnout proportionately in Seattle than outside of Seattle. In our state, DJ, I think that we don't have as many people who are Republican who are far right. You do have plenty of Republicans, particularly outside of the suburban crescent, who support President Trump. His numbers nationally among Republicans continue to be quite high, and that's not uncommon when your candidate wins, whether he was your choice or not. And I think that's what we're seeing happen here. At the same time, we're not where Massachusetts is. Massachusetts is currently governed. The governor is Charlie Baker, a Republican.
Yeah.
Charlie Baker was able to do in 2014 what I could not do here, which was basically move to the left and embrace marriage equality, for example, and in doing so was able to win, he's not the first Republican to be governor there in the last 30 years, as we all know.
Yeah.
But in Washington, there were still enough conservative Republican voters that in order to keep the base, you could only go so far as a candidate.
Yeah.
And every candidate, left or right, running as a Democrat or Republican, has to always manage that, as you already observed, that difficulty of keeping your base while also expanding your appeal to pick up people from the other side. And I was able to do that, but with 200,000 to 300,000 Democrats crossing over to vote for me, but it wasn't enough, obviously.
47 out of 49. That's something.
Massachusetts does have a Republican governor, but you could seat all of the Republican legislators in both houses in Massachusetts at 2 or 3 tables in the corner of this room.
Yeah, interesting.
Truly.
Any questions from you all in the audience? I want to make sure that we can empower your participation here as well. Senator Gorton, do we see a hand up back there? Great.
Hello, and thank you for your comments and your observations on the political climate. So my question has to do with the news media. I'm wondering, as elected officials, as political experts, and given the current tide of antagonism for the First Amendment that we see broadcast, I'm wondering if you think that political leaders have a role in pushing back and supporting the First Amendment with respect to the ongoing assault, not in the day-to-day interactions, but there's an overarching need, I think, and I'm asking you, for pushback on the importance of keeping that institution alive and respected. Is there a role for politicians in pushing back?
Yes.
There is, but just what it is another question.
Well, I think it begins with speaking up and defending the First Amendment. I think that our Democratic Republic faces a number of challenges, but one of those is the decline of professional journalism. You can argue that the First Amendment and the use, and free speech generally, not the amendment, but free speech itself, has never been more robust, in part because there are more megaphones than ever. There are more town squares than ever. They exist on the internet, right? They're virtual town squares and virtual megaphones. We've never had more speech than we have right now. At the same time, in that maelstrom of speech, we need objective analysis and reporting of facts that I think is under threat. It's under threat from a president who declares every story he disagrees with fake news. But it's also under threat from the mainstream media, where they've decided, whether they're Fox News or MSNBC, to sort themselves out based on their viewership demographics and basically play to the base, which I think is extremely unfortunate. It's not unprecedented. Our country will survive it. I mean, until the AP and UPI and Reuters came along after the turn of the 20th century, yellow journalism was the rule. Newspapers were almost always partisan newspapers. And so we've been through this before, but it's a loss for our country to see the decline of professional journalism and attacks on journalism and on related important issues like public records, because we need those to have the kind of robust discussion we need, that we should have to really understand issues and have a fulsome discussion of them. The last point I'll make is about the suppression of free speech is start on the college campuses if you want to protect it, because what's going on there today is very disturbing. I'm on KOW every month, and this is often a topic that comes up. Left, right, and center, those of us on that panel all are very concerned by the suppression of free speech that we're witnessing on our campuses today, illustrated just this week by the resignation of yet another professor at Evergreen, who apparently made the mistake of espousing views that weren't quite correct enough for some of the people on campus.
I want particularly to emphasize Rob's last point. I think the threat to free speech may be greatest in many of our colleges and universities. And in addition to people in political office speaking up for free speech, we need the faculty of our colleges and universities doing much more of that than they are.
This might be more a question for Senator Gorton, since you're on the 9/11 Commission. I just wonder, do you think we face more of a threat from domestic or international terrorism today?
Our national security is not threatened by international terrorism. It may be by a country like North Korea and some others, but always, it seems to me, the greatest threat to a free country come from within the free country itself. When people stop believing in the importance of free speech, the previous question, stop being willing to listen to any views other than their own. This country faces major threats, both internally and externally. I would say probably more internally, but that doesn't mean that the external ones aren't vital and aren't very significant. They are.
Let me ask you a follow-up question on that, Senator, and this builds on our conversation over dinner last evening. We talked at some length about the politics and efficacy of impeachment. And I think we all took that term very seriously, and you had a lot of thoughts to share on it. I wonder if you just would share your thoughts on impeachment and this administration.
Well, I have to start with the proposition that I'm a never-Trumper from the very beginning. I didn't vote for him. I didn't vote for Hillary either. But I have nothing invested in defending the present presidency. I will say this about impeachment. High crimes and misdemeanors in the Constitution of the United States do not require a violation of the criminal code in order to be invoked. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, who's now more in the news because of a musical than he has been in a long time, in one of the Federalist Papers spoke of the fact he almost could have been speaking about Trump, as so misusing the office that impeachment was appropriate. And I've noted in my own history reading about the several major impeachments they've been, usually the impeachment charge, the formal charge in the House, is not the real reason for the proceeding. It's a crutch to get you to the real reason for the proceeding itself. That was even true in connection with the most recent, the one on which I had to vote myself, the Clinton impeachment. The lies and the subordination of justice were crutches in order to allow people who just detested Clinton to vote for his conviction. However, no impeachment trial ever works unless it's bipartisan. Never has in the past, and it almost certainly won't in the future. The Founding Fathers were pretty good on that. They required only a majority vote in the House to file articles of impeachment. They required a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict and to remove someone from office. It's a very, very serious question, because a conviction of the president of impeachment is to reverse the verdict of the voters of the people of the United States in an election for president. And it cannot and should not be done frivolously. It shouldn't be done just over a difference of opinion on particular issues. It's got to be more profound than that. But I believe the case may very well be there at the present time.
Just to clarify that, do you think impeaching the president, do you think that there are grounds to impeach the president in your view?
The grounds for impeachment are whatever the House and Senate decide they are.
Yeah, and you, of course, always have the senator's prerogative to tell me to shut up. But if you wanted to make national news, if you were in the Senate, and as you were when the House impeached President Clinton, if the House were to vote on articles of impeachment for President Trump, how do you think you would vote?
Pardon?
How do you think you would vote if you were sitting in the Senate and the House passed articles of impeachment?
Tell me first what the articles are.
Very, very reasonable.
In the Clinton impeachment, I managed to act in a way in which had no constituency at all, voting not guilty on one count and guilty on the other.
Yeah.
I'm not at all sure I was right.
Rob, what are your thoughts on this question? It's such a delicate one. I mean, there's a lot of political fervor around it on the left. But for it to be real, it needs to be bipartisan, and maybe we're not there yet. Maybe we're getting closer than we think. What do you offer?
I think there's a risk a risk of running to impeachment whenever you have a strong disagreement with the incumbent president.
Yeah.
I think that was a risk that they took in the Congress when President Clinton was in office. In retrospect, maybe it wasn't a good risk to take.
Yeah.
Maybe it was not an appropriate use of the impeachment process. I think he was guilty of perjury, in connection with the Lewinsky issue, but
Yeah.
was that a high crime or misdemeanor? Again, it's a political judgment that the senators and the House have to make, but we saw how that turned out.
Yeah.
With respect to Trump, there are a couple of problems that Senator Gillibrand and others have in demanding that he resign or threatening impeachment if he doesn't. The first is that with respect to the sexual harassment claims, they're talking about behavior and actions that the president allegedly took before he became president. I'm pretty sure that Mr. Hamilton and his colleagues were referring to high crimes and misdemeanors while the president was in office, or at least that was what they envisioned would happen. Not that I suppose you couldn't find out that a president committed some crime before they became president and based an impeachment on that, back to Senator Gorton's point. But I think that the reason we have an impeachment process is principally to remove a president who has acted wrongly while in office. An example would be Richard Nixon. And of course, he chose to resign before they could impeach him. So that's the first problem is the sexual harassment claims predate his presidency. The second problem that Senator Gillibrand and her allies will have is that he won the election after news about his behavior came out. So did Bill Clinton. There were stories about his behavior as well that were public and were pretty well covered by the media, and he won his election. Yeah. And I never heard anyone suggest that his actions towards women before he became president should be a basis for impeachment when he was president.
Yeah.
Finally, you have the Russian...
And they weren't.
And they weren't.
No.
Right. It was the Lewinsky issue, the fact that he had an affair with her and then lied about it, basically perjured himself, which was really the key there. It's what he did, what he did literally in the White House, I guess, as it turned out with Monica Lewinsky. The other issue with Trump, of course, is the Russia investigation.
Yeah.
And we'll have to see what the Mueller investigation comes up with before we can decide whether or not there are grounds there. Even then, you'd have, I think, it's a closer call about whether any actions that were taken by the campaign before the election can count towards high crimes and misdemeanors after taking office. Mm-hmm. It's a closer call, though, because it did involve the election. So everyone will be looking closely at what Mueller comes up with. So far, what we've come up with is, Flynn, which didn't involve Russia, and other claims. So it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out.
I'll give you
An impeachment trial is not a criminal trial in the normal sense by any stretch of the imagination. So you can, a member voting on impeachment can know perfectly well that the president did whatever the charge is, but still vote not guilty because it isn't sufficient to overturn the election. That was my own rationale, that the pure perjury charge, it was way too small to cause the president to lose his office. But the obstruction of justice was on a higher level, and that really did implicate him. I'm not entirely certain that I was right on either one of those, but the fact is that there are two different judgments that members of Congress have to make.
Yeah.
Did the president do it? Is it sufficient to overturn an election?
It's just like in one vote, you're voting guilty or not guilty, and on what the sentence should be.
Yeah.
Keep him in office or take him out of office.
Yeah. It's just so crazy that we're even having this conversation. I appreciate you indulging me. Let me ask you both, in the limited time that we have, recognizing that we're in this sort of crazy time, left, right, middle, upside down, media, interest groups, for the folks in this room, the elected officials, the advocates, and the people watching on TVW that are actively engaged in the civic dialogue. Rob, we'll start with you first, give you the last word, Senator. How would you counsel this audience? What advice would you give them in terms of navigating this turbulent time in our politics?
A, don't despair. Our country's been through worse. B, there's no problem that can't be fixed by the next election, one way or the other. And then that can be undone in an election after that. But C, I think that the polarization of our country is a real concern. And I know a lot of people, ranging from President George W. Bush to President Obama, are very concerned about it, are actually talking to each other about it. I do think this is an issue that we need to constructively address as a nation. And I think it's up to our current leaders and former leaders to play a role in trying to bridge that chasm and restore a measurable degree of civility to civil discourse.
Great.
Excellent answer, Rob. That was terrific. I can hardly do anything but agree with you on it. But basically, to people here in this audience, don't despair. Keep on chugging forward on your program. Lots of things can take place without affecting the Congress of the United States or the President or even the legislature for that matter. The one worst thing that can happen to Americans is to stop caring and stop acting as citizens. Work hard, make up your own minds on subjects, listen to other people. Basically, I guess we have to say it up here, you never learn anything while you're talking. And then go out and act to better the society in which you live. Every one of you, every one of us can play a role in that connection.
Rob McKenna, Slade Gorton, thank you very much, gentlemen.